Well, it's been 20 months now since the country's lockdown started and curfews were imposed. And some rights groups are now fed up. AfriForum has written to Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs Minister Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma to bring an end to the curfew. The group has given Dlamini-Zuma until Friday to respond. Daniel Eloff, AfriForum's legal representative, joins me now from Vereeniging. Very good evening, Daniel. Thank you so much for joining us today. So please talk to me about this letter of demand that you've sent through to the Cooperative Governance Minister.
Well, thank you, Tony. It's lovely to be here. In a nutshell, it's quite simple. What we're asking is for the Minister of Cogta to simply provide the reasoning and the evidence that curfews at this point in the fight against COVID-19 is an effective measure to fight COVID-19, to prevent the risk of COVID-19 spreading, and then obviously to weigh that up against the downside of imposing these curfews. In South Africa, obviously, in terms of administrative law, we have a right to rational, reasonable, and informed decision-making by our government, and that's simply what we're requesting, is just to be provided with that reasoning and with the underlying evidence that points to the fact that curfews are an effective measure against COVID-19.
So the minister could simply say, look, the numbers are down, curfew is working.
Yeah, well, I think they'd be the first to admit that the reason numbers are down at the moment is because vaccination rates are looking relatively decent, although they're not where government wants them to be. I think that's the first thing. The second thing we need to keep in mind is, yes, we're at the lowest point that we've been at. I think if you look at this numbers, we're almost where we were at in May 2020 at this point with the active daily cases. And during the rest of the pandemic, we had a lot more stringent measures. The curfews were stricter. We had a bunch of other measures, yet despite that fact, we had rising COVID cases. Now, at this point where we really don't have a stringent curfew at this point, we're seeing relatively low cases. If you even think about the fact that we had an election exactly 2 weeks ago and that COVID takes about 2 weeks to present in patients, it's quite clear we're not going to see this immediate spike, despite the fact that millions of South Africans gathered together merely 2 weeks ago to exercise their democratic rights. So at this point, I think it's quite evident the curfew doesn't really have the effect that the minister necessarily says it does, or if it does, they can simply just provide that evidence to us.
Why do you think they haven't done so far?
Well, I mean, that's probably up for debate. I think the one constant we've seen during the past 20 months of this national state of disaster is that the reasoning behind a lot of these measures have been quite scant. Even in litigation, and some of the biggest sort of, if you can put it in inverted commas, anti-lockdown litigation during the past 20 months, the minister has been quite reluctant to provide the evidence, most notably in the tobacco case and also in the SAB cases that came afterwards. The reasoning wasn't as evident. It wasn't as clear why government necessarily put in the measures that they did. And I don't think anyone's saying, well, there's no reasoning behind any lockdown measures. It's simply that South Africans have a constitutional right to informed decision-making, and that if the decision is therefore informed by underlying evidence and expert evidence and reports, then they should take the South African public into their confidence and provide them with that evidence.
So you've given the minister up until Friday to respond, and if she doesn't, what then?
Well, I have to admit that I really do hope the minister does respond. The reason we wrote to the minister is to try and engage in dialogue. We've seen again during the pandemic that some government entities have been willing to engage with civil society, most notably on the question of whether or not hot food and various other products could be sold. A bunch of civil rights organizations wrote to government, that was during May and June last year, and government said, well, good, we understand what you're saying, and they took that away. Similarly, with the prohibition initially on exercise outdoors, it was quite limited, and at some point it was banned, and civil society stood up wrote to government and they responded positively. And we hope that we get a similar positive response at this point and that government's willing to engage with us. And if you also consider the fact that government itself is saying, well, we need to start looking at sort of bringing in an end to the national state of disaster. It can't continue ad infinitum. And we need to start looking at alternative measures to deal with the pandemic beyond the sort of the massive waves and peaks that we've seen so far.
Yeah, I was actually wanted to go there because you're calling for the implementation of national curfews to be ceased with immediate effect. As basically challenging the national state of disaster, which was renewed when on 13 November over the weekend?
Yes, well, yeah, on Monday we got the promulgation of the extension. I think we need to also distinguish between the fact that the curfew is but one of the measures that are currently in place. We still have a bunch of other restrictions, most notably the fact that people are still limited in certain public gatherings. There's still a prohibition on certain, like the borders are still closed, etc. So we're not asking for the entire thing to be toppled and sort of rather gradual return to normal life, especially as vaccination rates in South Africa are climbing and as more and more people are able and informed on how to deal with COVID, how to properly sanitize and how to live within this sort of post-pandemic world.
All right. Thank you so much for speaking with us, Daniel, this evening. And I'm sure we'll catch up with you probably on Friday just to see whether you've received a response at all from the minister. Okay. That's AfriForum's Daniel Eloff there. He's the legal representative as AfriForum is basically calling. They have some demands, have issued a letter to the minister with certain demands. We'll see if the minister actually responds.